Anyways, a couple of announcements from the camp. If you purchased a t-shirt when you registered and you haven't picked it up yet, you should pick it up before you leave, because why else would you have purchased a t-shirt? If you are wanting to go over to the party tonight and you need a way to get there, you can meet at the registration desk at 4:30, so right after this session, and they're gonna, by they I mean we as a camp are going to help organize rides for people to get over to the party event. The one tonight is not an easy walk from here. It's a couple of miles, unlike last night's, which was an easy walk, so you'll probably want to find a way to get there. And then finally, if you're planning on participating in the sprints tomorrow and you're looking for a way to get to the sprint venue, which is also a bit of a drive from here, there's a sign-up sheet on the whiteboard across the street, across the hallway from the registration desk, where you can sign up, and we'll set up some ride shares, so we've got ways for people to get out there. That's what I know.
Get to it.
No, that's cool. I like started out this camp saying, if you go to a session and you don't like it, feel free to leave. So I can't accuse Matthew of leaving, jerk. Joe's announcements were dumb. Hi, I'm Joe. My name is Joe Shindelar, or eojthebrave. Joe spelled backwards. It's not actually meant to be pronounceable, but that's on Twitter or Drupal.org or pretty much anything internet related, since I invented this name in, like, I don't know, 2001 or so, when I was getting really into playing Warcraft and I needed to sound intimidating to my enemies. I currently work at Drupalize Me. I spend a lot of time working on creating Drupal training materials. Drupal 8, Drupal 7, whether it's module development or pointing and clicking around in the views user interface. We try to teach people about Drupal and how to build sites with Drupal. And I'm a member of the local Twin Cities Drupal user group, which is awesome. Today, I'm going to be talking about the various different ways that module developers can alter Drupal 8 in order to provide new functionality or change the way that Drupal does things that it does currently. Before I do that, though, I'd love to get a sense of, like, of the people in the room. Raise your hand if you've written modules for Drupal before. All right, cool. Raise your hand if you've written modules for Drupal 8. All right, it's like the same people. Awesome. So, for reference, this talk is specific to Drupal 8. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about really only apply to Drupal 8. Some of them apply to Drupal 7, and I will also sometimes make analogies to Drupal 7, because it's kind of the best way to understand the way that things in Drupal 8 work. This is a pretty high-level talk. I'm going to explain the concepts and the various different ways that you might go about approaching writing a module, and sort of the design philosophy and why you would choose one technique over another. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail about the specifics of any one particular implementation, but I will provide you with links in slide form so that you can find out that information. Yeah?
Do you have this slide online?
I do. I have this slide deck is online, lb.cm/lowercase m, uppercase e, uppercase p. I will also display this link again every time that I display other links, so you only have to memorize this one. Hey, stop interrupting.
Sorry.
So we're going to talk about the various ways that you can alter, extend, and enhance Drupal core. In Drupal 8, that consists roughly of plugins, services, events, and hooks. We'll talk about what each of those things are, what they can accomplish, and why and when you might want to choose one of those techniques over any of the others. I'll show some example use cases for each one, and then talk a bit about just that process, like how do you choose? Should I use an event or a hook? The reason that we talk about this, and the reason that all of these different techniques, like events and hooks and services, exist, is because as module developers, our number one goal is to not hack Drupal core. We should be able to do anything that we want Drupal to, or we should be able to make any changes that we want to the way that Drupal functions, or add any new functionality to Drupal without having to make modification to Drupal's core code itself. In fact, I would say that if you encounter a scenario where Drupal does something and you can't write custom module code that alters that so that you can change the way that it works, but that's probably a bug in Drupal core. And I would consider opening an issue and saying, you know what, I'm trying to accomplish this, and that's impossible. And then hopefully get it fixed. The reason for this is that one way to think about Drupal core is as a bunch of code that's been written to solve some already identified use cases or problems that people have encountered. And it's like everybody wants to have a way for users to log into their site. So we'll provide a generic way or a generic user login system. But we also want to make sure that you can modify that if you have any customizations that you need to make. So for example, at a university, you might have your like LDAP or single sign-on system, and you would like people to log into the Drupal site via their LDAP credentials instead of via the user table in your Drupal site. That process can be altered within Drupal so that you can replace Drupal's existing login functionality with whatever you need for your custom application. We encourage the people to do that without making changes to the core code so that it makes it easier to maintain your core code base when security updates or future updates to Drupal come out. If you went in and started hacking up the user module and making it connect to your SSO server, which you could totally do, right? It's just PHP. The problem is when a new version of Drupal comes out or when a security release comes out, you now need to figure out like what's different between Drupal 8.2 and the 8.1 version that I'm running, plus what hacks that I make to my version, and do I need to keep those hacks in my version or not? Instead of just saying, oh, Drupal 8.2 is out, I'll just grab the new code and drop it in and run the update and we're good to go. And that's kind of like the primary, like why you should be able to write all of your custom code without hacking Drupal's code. In addition to that, once you learn these patterns and how they work, you can also write your own custom code that implements the patterns so that other people can come along and modify the way that your thing works without having to hack your module. A really great example of this would be something like the voting API module, which is a custom or a contributed module for Drupal that makes it so you can vote on things, essentially. And if you were the maintainer of the voting API module, you might say, okay, you know what? I want people to be able to vote on these things, and then I want to tally the votes, and I just want to sum them all together and display whichever thing got the most votes. But then I might come along and be like, well, you know what? For my specific use case, I really need instant runoff voting. And you might have a use case where you're like, well, I need instant runoff voting except on Thursdays, and like the third Wednesday of the month, I need it to be tallied slightly different. Everybody has their own really complex use cases, and as the module maintainer, there's no way that I could possibly accommodate every single potential way that someone might want to tally votes. But the mechanism for allowing someone to vote is still the same, right? It's like yes or no. And so the voting API module says, instead of providing infinite ways that you could tally votes, what I'll do is I'll provide a really simple, just sum them all together, with a set of tools that will allow you as a module developer to come along and customize that and say, instead of using the built-in one, use my tallying mechanism instead. And you can do that without having to alter the voting API module at all, which is, again, when it's time to update the voting API module because the security release comes out, you don't have to worry about, did I make changes to this? Do I need to figure out what those are? I can just grab the new code and drop it in, and everything should continue to work. So in order for a system like this to work in Drupal, there's a handful of different types of ways that we interact with the core system. And those break down roughly to things that need to be able to provide a list of information to Drupal and sort of answer. So I guess like provide information or respond to events that are happening. You might say, a user just logged in. I want to respond to that and provide different information or a different way for someone to authenticate. So you have kind of roughly that. Like, as a module developer, I may want to respond to some event that is happening within the Drupal system, or I may want to interact when something is already happening. Maybe a piece of data is being loaded from the database, and I'd like to also do something when that happens. You oftentimes have to answer questions. So there's a lot of times in Drupal where the core system will say, hey, every module that's enabled, can you give me a list of the field types that you provide so that I can display them in a list for the user so they can choose the one that they want to use? Or, hey, every module that's enabled, what blocks do you have that you might want to allow someone to display on the page? So oftentimes Drupal is asking that question of, anybody got anything they'd like to add to the list? Modules can provide new functionality. So believe it or not, there are actually some things that Drupal doesn't do. And occasionally we need to write modules that just provide all new functionality. You know, that might be a shopping cart. It might be the voting API. Basically anything that you can think of. And then there's also times where you need to alter existing functionality. Drupal's already got, again, I'm going to use the user login system, but Drupal already has a system for authenticating logged in users. Instead of providing an entirely new one, you can just make minor alterations to the existing one to get it to work the way that you need to. So we say, don't hack core, instead do one of those things. And you can do so in Drupal 8 by using a hook, or like using a hook to respond to some thing going on in the system, writing a plugin, creating a new service to provide new functionality, or responding to some kind of event. In Drupal 7, if you're familiar with modules for Drupal 7, all of these types of things, answering questions, altering existing functionality, providing new functionality, would have been done by writing a hook. We still have hooks in Drupal 8, but we also have a bunch of new systems for doing some of these same things. I'm going to walk through what those are. In no particular order. Well, in a very particular order, because the order of my slides. But I'm not like, oh, this is the best one. You should know this one. And this other one that I talked about last. So we'll start out with plugins. This is one of the new systems in Drupal 8. And this is probably, as a module developer, the system that you're likely to encounter first. In my experience, one of the first types of, first things that you'll end up doing as a module developer is something like, I want to create a custom block, or I want to add a new field type to the system. And so oftentimes you're going to encounter plugins first. Plugins perform that task of answering the question, hey, all of the modules that are enabled, do any of you have a block? Hey, everybody that's got, is providing new functionality, do you have a new field type that you'd like to provide? Plugins are used to provide configurable functionality in a way that allows Drupal as a system to locate them all and then provide a list to an administrator or an end user where they can choose from one or many options. And you see this pattern all the time in Drupal. There's lots of modules provide different blocks. And as an administrator, I can choose one or many blocks to be enabled on any given page at any given time. There are a lot of different field types or field widgets in Drupal. And as an administrator configuring a new content type, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm choosing from a drop-down list of all of the possible field types which one I would like to use. Generally, when you see that type of system, it's probably using the plugin system in Drupal. Plugins are almost always used in the scenario where it's like, I need a list of things that can do this type of functionality and allow someone else to choose from that list which one that they would like to use. You could do this in Drupal 7 with hooks, and it was almost always the pattern where you would have an info hook that was like hook block info, and you would provide an array of information that was sort of the metadata about the blocks that your module provided, and information about how to, like callback functions basically, or information about how to execute that particular bit of functionality. Plugins work much the same. They provide metadata so that the system can discover them and provide a list for humans to read through and make use of. And then they provide a consistent way of accessing the functionality that plugin provides. So a block, for example, the functionality might be display some content on the page, or display some HTML. In comparison to the way that Drupal 7 did this, I actually really like plugins. And the reason that I like them is that they provide what I would consider to be a much better developer experience. they put all of the code in one place, so it makes it easy. Like, I'm going to provide a new block for Drupal 8. Essentially, what I do is I implement the block interface class, more or less. And by doing so, I'm essentially signing a contract and saying, I know exactly what methods I need to implement in order to have a block displayed on the page. Versus Drupal 7, it was like, well, you implement hook block info, and you provide a random array of metadata, and then your block will be listed. Like, you could actually place it somewhere, but it won't actually do anything until you realize, I need to implement hook block view. And then, like, have some code in there. And it's all these hooks that, once you know the pattern, it's pretty easy, and you can remember it. But discovering the pattern is really hard. Drupal 8 plugins make it a lot easier to discover the pattern, because you're often just, well, not often, you're always just implementing an interface. And the benefit of an interface is I can very quickly discover what methods I'm required to provide in my class and what they should be doing. The other thing that's really cool about plugins is, you think about a block. A lot of the things that a block does are fairly consistent. It's like, there's a form that you can fill out to change the title of the block and configure its visibility. And the functionality that happens when you submit that form is the same for every single block, unless you decide to slightly alter it for your particular use case. Blocks have, like, as Drupal, wow, this is an interesting user story. As Drupal, I need to be able to check the access permissions of the block. So I have a method that I can always call that says, what are the access permissions for this block? And in most cases, that doesn't change. But you could, if you wanted to, alter it. In order to facilitate that, in most cases, the plugin system will provide a base implementation of a plugin. So in this case, we've got the block base class. So if I wanted to provide a new block, I would actually extend the base class. And all I need to do is the things that are like unique to my specific block. In this case, it's probably going to be implement the build method and provide some content, and implement the label method and give it a title. I could, if I wanted to, override any of the other methods, but I'm not required to, and those are filled in by the base class with like default functionality. It helps reduce a lot of boilerplate code, which is really cool. Examples of things that are plugins in Drupal 8, I like pretty much everything, but this is some of them. Blocks, like we've been talking about. Field types, so when you're creating a new content type or editing any entity and you're adding different types of fields, those are plugins. The field formatters, so the thing that determines, now that you've collected the data, what should it look like, those are plugins. Field widgets are plugins. Views makes heavy use of plugins, both for like the view styles for the display of information, but also for like backends for how it queries different systems. Another common system where you'll see this is the actions system. Basically anything where you've got a module needs to be able to provide functionality that matches like a known definition. So the hardest part about implementing plugins is figuring out which base class you should extend and where the code should live, so that Drupal can discover it and put it into the list of blocks or field types or whatever the case may be. The basic recipe for that is, the first thing you need to do is you need to figure out what type of plugin you're implementing, because the type of plugin will inform where the code goes and how Drupal discovers it. There's a handful of different discovery mechanisms. The most common one is annotated classes. So block plugin. So let's say I want to create a block plugin. Once I know that the type of plugin I want to create is a block, based on that, I can figure out that, okay, blocks use annotated class discovery for discovering where the code is that they're going to execute. So that means I need to create a new class in the appropriate namespace. I'll know which namespace to put it in, again, based on the type of plugin that I'm implementing. And then you'll fill in the annotation, which provides the metadata. I'll know what to put in the annotation, again, based on the type of plugin. The thing that's tricky is this changes for every plugin type. So the metadata for a field is different than the metadata for a block, for instance. So you do need to know the type of plugin that you're going to implement. Then you need to figure out if there is a base class that you can extend. There almost always is a base class. You're not required to extend it, but my rule of thumb would be start by finding the base class and extending it, and going that route until you discover that you have a valid reason to not extend the base class. In most cases, there's a lot of boilerplate code involved in creating a plugin that will be covered by the base class. So blocks, again, for example, it's like the form that you use to configure a block. There's a really good chance that your custom code doesn't need to change that at all. So just use the default and only change it if you need to. Once you know the type of plugin and the base class, you'll know what the interface is. So the PHP class interface for that plugin type. Knowing the interface will help you figure out what methods you need to implement in your class. You can read all of those methods on the interface should be documented and tell you, like, for the block, plugin build method, the expectation is that it will return a render array, and that render array will be displayed as the content of the block. And the label method should return just a string, and the string will be used as the human readable label of the block, and so forth. It's easy, I promise. This is an example of what it might look like to implement a really simple plugin. Ours is we're creating a new ice cream flavor plugin. So we figured that the plugin type is ice cream flavor. That told us that, excuse me, that informed that it's using annotated class discovery. So I know, okay, I need to put a class in the specific namespace for the plugin, and it needs to provide an annotation. The annotation, if you're not familiar with that, is this sort of specially formatted doc block comment. This data here is then read in by Drupal as metadata about your plugin, and that's how, for example, the Drupal blocks interface knows what to use as the name of your block when an administrator is choosing, from the list of blocks and where to put it, and then extend the base class and provide whatever functionality. This is a somewhat contrived example, but I think it helps to kind of get the point across. The other thing that you might want to do with plugins, in addition to implementing an existing plugin type, is provide a new plugin type. So if what you want to do is add new functionality to an already existing system within Drupal, you're going to implement that plugin type. But if you want to provide, if you're the voting API module, and you want to provide the ability for anyone to implement a new plugin for tallying voting votes, you're going to provide a new plugin type, and that plugin type would be something like, vote tallier. The recipe for doing that is you implement the default plugin manager, you implement a new class that extends the default plugin manager, and the default plugin manager basically provides all the defaults, and you're done. Really, all you need to do is extend the default plugin manager, use that in order to choose the discovery method that people should use for your plugin type, determine how instances of that plugin are going to be initialized, and then you need to define your interface so that people who come along later and want to write a plugin of that type will know what interface to implement. It sounds really complicated, but thanks to this default plugin manager class, it's actually relatively easy to get started, because the default plugin manager handles pretty much, it handles defaults for all of this. You get the option to change it. Like if, for example, you had a really good reason to use YAML-based discovery instead of annotated class discovery, you could change it. But in my experience, for the most part, using the defaults works for the vast majority of use cases. I'm not going to get too much more in depth on that right now, but I have written a bunch about it in the past. This article in particular goes into a lot of depth on the sort of the different types of plugin discovery and how they work and why you might want to use one over the other and so forth. I think that as a module developer, it's worthwhile to take the time to understand how Drupal's plugins and the discovery of those plugins works under the hood, because once you understand that, the whole system starts to make a bit more sense. And it's like, oh, you mean that thing that sounds really complicated is actually just a class, and I just need to put it in this namespace? Sweet, I know how to do that. But again, you can, this link here, lb.cm/mep, will take you to the slide deck where there's links to all of these other resources. I also have notes here to tell you about the session that takes place right after this one that is an introduction to object-oriented programming and will inform you about this stuff. But then my session got moved to the last time slot on the last day, so this is useless information now. After you've mastered plugins, another thing you might want to learn about and consider is using services. Services are a programming paradigm that is not unique to Drupal. So plugins are really a Drupalism. It's kind of a design pattern in a sense, but it's a design pattern that's specific to Drupal. Nobody else is really doing exactly that. Services, on the other hand, are a design pattern that's really common in pretty much every programming language and system in existence. We're going to talk a little bit about how Drupal deals with services. If plugins are the answer to the question of, I would like to be able to provide any number of things that can function as a block, and there can be many of them active at the same time, so many blocks or many fields can be active at the same time. Services are generally used to provide new functionality in which there can only ever be one active thing of that functionality at a given time. So for example, your site is likely only ever your site is only going to be configured to work with one database type at any given time. You're using MySQL, or you're using SQLite, or you're using, I'm sure there are other database types, and you're using one of them. I don't know why, but you are. And so you're using the service that allows you to interact with the MySQL database. You might have a module that provides interaction with Twitter, and you're implementing the Twitter API. So you can provide a service that implements the Twitter API. But you're only ever going to have one instance of that service active at any given time. You could swap it out for another implementation. So you could say, you know what, I want the mock Twitter API because I'm going to run tests instead of the live Twitter API. But you're not likely to have both the live one and the mock one in use at the same time. Services are awesome because they're decoupled from the core module and from your code, making it so that they can be swapped out really easily for other implementations of the same service that are slightly different. This is useful for testing and a lot of other things. Testing is probably the one that comes up the most. And again, that idea of, I'm the Twitter module. I'm not the Twitter module. There is a Twitter module. And the Twitter module has code that allows it to interact with the Twitter API. And that's great. But it also has a bunch of tests that run to make sure that its blocks and everything that's kind of part of the Drupal side of things work. When you're running the tests, it's silly to go off and query the Twitter API, the live API, during a test run, because that takes a lot of time, and you might not have the test fixtures and data in a live Twitter account that you need to test things. So instead, just swap out the service that implements the Twitter API with a dummy one that says, you know, instead of going off to the live site and getting real data, just always return false here. And that way you can know for sure when the test performs this interaction what the outcome will be. Services also provide for better reusability of code, which is cool. And I think one of the things that we're going to start to see more and more with Drupal 8 and the use of things like services is that people will start to write code that is reusable outside of the context of just a Drupal module, something that was historically fairly difficult to do because your code was so tightly coupled to the fact that it is a Drupal module. Services, in a lot of cases, I think you'll start to see are the code that implements the service in Drupal is actually really just kind of a thin wrapper around some other PHP library. For example, in Drupal 8 core, the service that's used for making HTTP requests is really just a thin wrapper around the Guzzle PHP library, which is an HTTP agent that's used by all kinds of PHP projects. And so that's pretty cool, I think. Examples of things that are services in Drupal 8, caching and database access, we talked about that roughly. The CSS and JavaScript asset optimizer, so the thing that grabs your JavaScript files and concatenates them all together into one giant impossible to debug file and caches it in the file system, and then that's a service. Plugin managers, so the things that implement the plugin types are generally services themselves. Anytime that there's integration with like a third-party API, that's likely to be a service. Again, things where you're going to have one active implementation of that functionality at any given time. The other thing to think about too is if in Drupal 7 we didn't really have this concept of services. We just had a lot of global functions. And so like the database service in Drupal was like any function that was db underscore something was the database service. Drupal 8 largely does away with that, like functions in the global namespace, and instead it encapsulates that into services. It can be a little trickier though to figure out what all of those available services are. Right now, the best way that I know to figure out what all the services are is if you go to api.drupal.org, and in the sidebar on the right-hand side, you click this link that says services. You get a big list of all of these services that are available in core, and you can filter the list and start to get some idea of what's available. I'm guessing one of the things that makes this tricky is that any module that you install can come along and add new services. And I'm like looking in the back corner over here, and I'm guessing that the Drupal console can tell you all of the services, like list all of the services on your site, yes. And then you could like grep it and ta-da, you know which ones are active. The thing is, it's like what's available depends a little bit on what modules you've enabled. Like when I enable the Twitter module, I now also have the Twitter service, but if I don't have the Twitter module, I don't have that. But the list on Drupal.org is a really great starting point. The recipe for creating a new service is the first thing you need to do is pick a unique name for your service. This is important because you need a way in the code later on to identify to Drupal and say, hey, Drupal's service container or thing that understands what services are available and how to initialize them. Can you give me the one that I just created? I need the Twitter service, or I need the database service. So you need to pick a unique name. My suggestion is always use the name of your module as a sort of prefix for your service name. So it would be like twitter.api, and then you might have twitter.mock.api as the mock service. Not strictly speaking a requirement, but a really good idea would be to define an interface for your service and then implement that interface. The benefit here is that when you provide an interface, you're providing documentation for other people that might want to, and future you, who want to provide a variation of that service. And then when you have the interface, you're basically saying like, anyone that uses an implementation of this service or any variation of the service can be guaranteed that it'll match this interface. So I know I can call methods that are defined in the interface and be assured that they will exist. I can call the Twitter API make API request method, and whether I have a copy of the mock service or the actual service, I know for sure that that'll exist and work. You then need to register your service that you've created with Drupal. There's a ton of these different services throughout the system, and in order to make it easy to, as a developer, get an instance of that service and have it be properly initialized, Drupal uses what's called a service container. The service container is responsible for using this registration information to know what services are available and how to turn them on, basically. So you need to register your service with Drupal in Drupal's service container. And then anytime you use the service, you should use it by getting a copy of the service from the service container. Or even better yet, using dependency injection in your controller to get a copy of the service from the service container. Not confusing at all, right? There's a lot of really great documentation about Drupal's services and how to implement services. In addition to that, Drupal 8 Core provides literally hundreds of services, and a great way to learn more about how the system works is to go take a look at some of the code in Drupal Core and see how Drupal Core is doing that. So if you're curious, how to implement your own service, take a look at how Drupal has implemented the HTTP client service as a wrapper around Guzzle, and that's a great example of how you might do something on your own. The scenario, again, the use case and when you might want to do this is anytime you've got code where only one active implementation of that is necessary at any time. My recommendation as a module author would be anytime you've got business logic that isn't like Drupal specific stuff, you should encapsulate that into a service, and then you should use your module as sort of like a thin wrapper around the service that implements the like Drupal specifics of it. So you might even, if you've got like really complex business logic that you need to run in order to provide the contents of a block, I would recommend encapsulating that business logic into a service and then implementing a block plugin that calls your service. The service can go off and query Twitter or whatever and get the list of most recent tweets and then display them. But that way you keep things as decoupled as you can from the Drupal specific parts. And hopefully that'll make it easier to maintain the code going forward. And as the specifics of how you interact with Drupal change, you won't have to go back every time and rewrite the things that are like your application's specific logic. That's the theory anyways. We'll see how it all works out. Right, as developers, we're always like, yeah, I've got this great new system that'll make sure I never have to rewrite my code again. I just have to rewrite it this one time so that it'll work. And then next time you're like, okay, that didn't quite work. But if I rewrite the whole thing again, it'll work next time. Right? The other new way that you can interact with Drupal in Drupal 8 is what's called events. Events are useful in some situations in Drupal where there is something is happening during the page building, during the process of building a page, and you would like to respond to that event. So, for example, a new node is being saved. Someone has filled out the form to create a new blog post and they've clicked the submit button, and Drupal is saving that entity to the database. It'll broadcast in an event. And it'll say, hey, anybody that's listening, in case you care, I'm saving a new blog post. Do you want to do anything about it? And as a module developer, this is your opportunity to respond and say, yeah, when new blog posts are saved, I also want to take a copy of the blog post and post it in Apple News because I do. And situations like that, something's happening in the system and I would like to respond. The use case for events and hooks gets a little bit muddled because there are some things that are events and there are some things that are hooks, but there are things that are hooks that could be events but aren't yet, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are and why-ish. But roughly, events are useful in the scenario where you either need to respond to the fact that something is happening within the system, or you would like to give other people the chance to respond to the fact that your code is doing something cool and they might want to react. Which is like basically what I just said. So events, you can react to what other things in the system are doing. If you're familiar at all with jQuery or like JavaScript in general, and writing JavaScript that interacts with the user interface, you're probably familiar with the event listener pattern already. jQuery, for example, you often bind to the click event of a link. And you say, when somebody clicks on this event, when somebody clicks on this link, I'd like to be notified so that my code gets executed and can do something. The event pattern in Drupal is roughly the same. You're saying, I'd like to bind to this particular event so that when it's triggered, you notify me and I can do whatever it is that I want to. It's a really, really common pattern in object-oriented programming, which is kind of cool because it means that if you've learned about events and how they work from some other system, or you're just familiar with that concept already, you can pretty easily translate it to Drupal. It also means that if you're learning how events work in Drupal, you now have information, like you have knowledge that you can transfer to other systems, which is cool because hooks are actually kind of a Drupalism. Like they're really great and they work really well, but only Drupal uses hooks. And if you learn how hooks work, you can work with Drupal, but you can't move to jQuery and understand how events work because you learned how Drupal hooks work. So I know that one of the hopes with the introduction of events into Drupal 8 is that we're now adapting patterns that other communities and frameworks are making use of, and it makes it easier for us as developers to transfer our knowledge between Symfony and Drupal and other PHP systems or even other language systems. There are two things that you do with events. You either subscribe to an event, which is saying, I want to get notified when this particular thing happens. And in order to do that, you need to figure out the name of the event that you want to subscribe to. There's a big list of them on Drupal.org. This is tough, again, because it's api.drupal.org lists all of the events that are triggered by Drupal core, but any module you install from contrib could potentially add new events. So it's a little hard to know what they all are at any given time, but there are ways of figuring that out. Once you know the name of the event that you would like to subscribe to, you basically create a new service, and you tag that service as an event subscriber. That service would then implement the event subscriber interface, and by doing so by tagging your service as an event subscriber, you're saying to the event dispatching system in Drupal, whenever somebody dispatches the node save event, find my service, which is this class, and call it. And that class is an implementation of this interface, which means I know for sure that it'll have these specific methods that you can call. Basically, you implement the event subscriber interface in the event subscriber namespace so that Drupal can find the class, and then tell it, this is the name of the event that I'm subscribing to. Here's the method on this class that I would like you to call whenever this event is triggered. So you're basically just registering. You're saying, when the event happens, call this code. Right? Not so bad. Your code will then be handed a copy of the event definition itself, which is like an object that contains the name of the event that was just triggered and any additional information that was provided by the code that triggered the event. So when an entity is saved, for example, Drupal core dispatches an event that says an entity is being saved. Here's a copy of the entity in case you want to know more about the specific entity that's being saved. The corollary to subscribing to events would be dispatching events. So if you're writing code that you want to trigger an event and let someone else be able to subscribe to it and potentially respond to that happening, you would want to dispatch a new event. And the process for doing that is to add a new class in the appropriate namespace, so your Drupal, your module name in the events namespace. That in this particular class is really just documentation of the fact that your event exists and what its name is. You need to add a class, excuse me. So you have basically you need to provide documentation of what your event is and when it gets triggered. And this is useful for anyone else that's like, hey, what events is this module triggered and under what conditions are they going to be triggered? You need to add a class that is an implementation of this Symfony event object. Drupal uses Symfony's event dispatcher roughly. It uses a really interesting version of Symfony's event dispatcher in order to deal with its events. But you basically need to say the name of the event and when it gets triggered, describe the event itself, and then in your code, whenever a node is saved or data is returned from the Twitter API or the thing is happening, you need to say, right now, I'd like to use the event dispatcher service to dispatch this event. And that's just saying, hey, here's my code that saves a node. Right after that was done, I'm going to dispatch the event. Other people can respond to it if they want to or not. When you dispatch an event, you do so by giving it the name of the event, which we defined earlier, a copy of the event object, which is like its name plus any additional data. And then really you're just like, here you go. I told you can do whatever you want with it, and I don't care. More resources about implementing events. I also wrote an article about this one in particular that goes into a bit more detail of how the event dispatcher works. And I would recommend, kind of like with the plugin system, where it's, if you understand how it works under the hood, it's a lot easier to know how and when to make use of it. I would say the same is true of the event dispatcher. Once you kind of understand, like, at a high level how the code is working, the pieces, it's easier to put the pieces together and understand the system. And then finally, the last one we're going to talk about is hooks. Hooks have actually been around for a really long time. They're like the workhorse of Drupal. They've been around since basically forever. I actually tried to do some research to figure out when hooks were first introduced into Drupal. Like, so what was the very first implementation of a hook, or the dispatching of that. And from the best that I could tell by going back through like Drupal's entire Git history is that hooks were first introduced sometime around March of 2001 into Drupal. So they've been around since basically forever. So I went and I looked at the commit that like adds the code that calls hooks in Drupal from March of 2001, and then I compared it to the code that calls hooks from Drupal 8, and it's like basically the same code with a bunch of try-catch statements added around it, because it's like, no, it's object-oriented. It's kind of wild though, because it is a testament to the fact that while hooks are very much a Drupalism and a little bit weird, they've worked really well for our community for a really long time in order to provide the flexibility and functionality that we've come to expect out of Drupal. They were introduced because at the time, in April of 2001, a lot of these things that we've just talked about, like services and events and plugins and all this object-oriented stuff, just wasn't possible in PHP. And so at the time, hooks were the best way to deal with this. Hooks are really great for situations where you need to alter some existing data. The most common use case that I see is when a form is created. So some module has created a form and they'd like to display it on the page, like the user login form. That form is described to Drupal as a form API array, so just a big array that defines the form itself. And then Drupal triggers a hook, and it says, hey, here's the definition of the form. Does anybody want to make some quick changes to this form before I display it to the end user? Maybe you want to add a new validation routine, or maybe you even want to add some new fields to the form, because right now it's just a username and password, but maybe you want like username, password, and like number of horns that you have before someone can log in. There is tons and tons of examples of hooks in Drupal. Again, in researching for this presentation, I went into it thinking, you know what? I bet Drupal 8 has way less hooks than previous versions of Drupal because it's got all of these new things like services and plugins and events. And then I was like, wow, the reality is Drupal 8 actually has way more hooks than previous versions of Drupal. So there are quite a few hooks still. Again, the most common use case for them at the moment that I see is altering forms. That's probably the first time that you're going to encounter it. And then it's hard, like with everything else, it's easy for me to say, oh, you use plugins in this scenario, and you use services in this scenario. And the answer is you use hooks in all the other scenarios. It's basically like if it isn't one of those things, it's a hook. Discovering what hooks are available is actually pretty easy to do. You can go to api.drupal.org, and there's a big page that lists all of the hooks, and you can print it out, and you can spend a weekend reading like the entire list, and you'll know what all the hooks are that are available and how and when to implement them. My favorite thing to do is to search for hook underscore some words roughly related to the thing that I'm trying to do. So like hook underscore blah. And they're like, oh, you mean hook underscore block info? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like maybe what I want. And then you can get it. Implementing a hook is really easy. You just have to know what the naming pattern is, and you write a function in your .module file that follows the naming pattern. There's a couple of requirements. Hooks have to live, implementations of hooks have to live in your modules .module file. Otherwise, Drupal can't find them. Dave's shaking his head at me. Most hooks.
Most.
Okay, if you're going to be pedantic, most hooks need to live in the .module file. There are like 4 that don't, and you can put them in your .install file. The token system, okay, so then this gets tricky again, right? Because it's like, If you're using Drush, Drush will look for hooks in a file named like mymodule.drush.inc. And if you're using tokens, it's like mymodule.tokens.inc. When in doubt, just put them in your module file. Drupal will find them there. So the pattern is you figure out what the name of the hook is. So if I'm going to implement hook form alter, the trick is I have to replace the word hook in the function name with the name of my module. So if my module is named example and I want to implement hook form alter, I'm going to write a function named example form alter. What gets passed to that function is really going to vary wildly depending on the hook that's being implemented. And the best way to figure out what arguments are being passed and what that hook will do is to look up the docblock documentation for the hook itself. So I would actually go to api.drupal.org and look at the documentation for hook form alter. And that documentation will provide me with a list of arguments that are going to be supplied to that function and an example implementation of it as well, which is kind of cool. So you get an idea of how you might make use of that in your own code. And then clear the cache. You add a new hook to your .module file. Drupal, in not all cases, but in a lot of cases, registers which modules provide implementations of which hooks so that it doesn't have to try to look it up every single time. As a rule of thumb, clear the cache to make sure that Drupal finds your implementation of the hook that you've just added. If you want to allow other people to implement hooks from what that your module provides, you need to perform a process that we refer to as invoking a hook. The recipe for doing that is pick a unique name for your hook. Again, I recommend prefixing it with like the name of your module. So if you're the Twitter API, you're not the Twitter API. But if you're the maintainer of the Twitter API module, you might name your hook something like Twitter API _ my badass hook. And then if you want to dispatch or invoke it, you use the Drupal module handler service, which has this invoke all method. You give it the name of the hook, whatever arguments you'd like to pass along, which is totally going to depend on your specific use case. When you do that, Drupal will perform the process of finding all of the modules that are enabled and checking them to see if they have a function that follows the naming pattern, which would be like example _ Twitter API _ my badass hook. And if it exists, it'll call that code. Calling alter hooks is slightly different. You use this, instead of saying invoke all hook name, you would say alter type or roughly hook name. The primary difference is that arguments passed to an alter hook, the first argument passed to an alter hook is passed by reference in PHP. So generally these are big arrays and passed by reference means that inside of the function that has just received the argument, you can make changes to that argument. So you can make changes to the array, and the changes will bubble up upstream to the calling code without you having to return something. So an implementation of hook form alter receives an argument that is $form. It's passed by reference, so any changes you make will automatically be percolated upstream to the code that dispatched the hook, versus having to say return form at the end of it. It's roughly the difference. The best places to find more information about the hooks that are available and how they work. These are really well documented in Drupal core and in most modules as well. You can find the documentation by looking in a module name, so it's maybe node.api.php or user.api.php. The user.api.php file will contain a list of all of the hooks that the user module provides and documentation about what they do and examples of implementations of those hooks. You can also look at all of that on api.drupal.org, which really just reads these files in and shows the doc blocks. The nice thing about knowing this, though, is that, again, contributed modules might provide hooks of their own, and those aren't included in the index on api.drupal.org. Okay, so then this always kind of like leaves the question of like, okay, so hooks and events, and they like roughly do the same thing, and they like you could use one or the other. Which one should I use and when should I use it? In when it comes to implementing either of these things, either implementing a hook or responding to event, it's either going to be one or the other. There's never a scenario where it's like there is a hook and an event for the exact same thing and you have to choose which of the two you want. There's always either a hook or an event. My guess, and so right now in Drupal 8, there's like about 1.5 billion hooks and like 10 events. It's maybe a few more events than that, but there are far more hooks than there are events. But I think that over time, we'll start to see Drupal trend more towards events and away from hooks. As things are converted more and more to plugins, as we find better ways to deal with things like the form API in an object-oriented fashion, we'll move more and more towards events. I think primarily we're going to see that just because events is a pattern that's present in other spheres outside of Drupal. It's simply because events are not a Drupalism. It hasn't happened yet because there's some things that hooks do really well that in the Drupal 8 development cycle we didn't come up with great ways to replicate that functionality as events. The one that I always think of is the hook form alter scenario, and the complexity to perform a form alter via an event just got so kind of overwhelming that it was like, or we could just leave it as functions that people can, write a new function and call the name of and understand this pattern already. There are issues open though to make that conversion happen, and there's people actively working on figuring out ways so that essentially like all hooks will become an event. I've even seen some issues where people have proposed like, well, just replace the like module handler with a thing that just turns around and dispatches events, and like so every single hook would become an event. It won't happen in Drupal 8 because Drupal won't break backwards compatibility of things, so you're not going to see a hook eliminated in Drupal 8, but I'm guessing that by Drupal 9 we'll see a lot of things converted from hooks to events. As such, if you're put in the position where you're writing code and you're trying to decide, should my code dispatch an event or should it invoke a hook, my recommendation is probably going to be you should dispatch an event. I think it's going to be more future-proof as Drupal trends toward that, towards using events for everything. If you're using that system in your code already, you're doing yourself a favor because you're using what is hopefully the direction that everyone's moving, and you're also implementing a pattern that future Drupal developers will understand, whereas a Drupal 9 developer might not even really understand the hook pattern because it's become obsolete at that point. Again, it's still, we'll see how it all shakes out, but my feeling is that we're definitely trending in that direction. But as all things Drupal are, we could postulate about when Drupal 9 might be released for a couple of years, and then we might decide in a couple of years that it'll be out in like 4 or 5 years. So you've got some time, and understanding how hooks work and knowing how to use them is still really important. So a quick recap. We talked about ways that you as a module developer could alter and extend or enhance Drupal without having to hack core. The systems that we talked about were plugins. Plugins, again, being sort of generally useful in the scenario where Drupal would like to get a list of things and provide that list to an end user who can choose from the list which implementation of that functionality they'd like to use, whether it's a field type or a block, or there's just tons of examples of this. What action to trigger when an event happens and so forth. We talked about services. Services are a great way to encapsulate like complex business logic, where when it's application code where you only have like one instance of it active at any given time, but the encapsulating it into its own discrete like unit of functionality helps make that code more reusable, and it also helps make it so that you can swap that code out for other implementations that are implementations of the same interface, but that perform the business logic slightly different for things like testing and so forth. This allows you to keep that really complicated code decoupled from Drupal, which just makes it much, much easier to write quality tests for your code and so forth and make it reusable going forward. Or even like, hopefully what we'll see is as we start to write more and more services as a Drupal community, the code that we're writing and the solutions that we're inventing will become useful to the larger PHP community, because the hard part, the problem that you've solved, is encapsulated as a PHP library, and you just got a thin wrapper around that is the service, which is basically just saying, hey Drupal, here's how to use this library that understands Google Maps or whatever the case may be. Events are a system that allows objects or pieces of code within an application to communicate with one another by saying, hey, I just did something, does anybody care? And then you can care or not care. And then hooks, which are Drupal's system for previously having accomplished all of these things, which are still around and will probably continue to be around for quite a while. Hooks are a naming convention. It's just name a function by following a specific pattern, and if you do so, Drupal will find that function and call it at the appropriate time in order to, as it turns out, kind of do all of these different things for different use cases. That's it. That's how Drupal works. We're kind of like right up to time, but I'm happy to answer questions if people want to ask questions. Yeah.
Do you have a suggestion on how to discover what events are available?
Drupal console to the rescue?
I was going to say, does console list registered events?
And not yet, because events are services that, and the container on Drupal is precompiled already.
Yeah.
So we're working on that.
You can, let's see.
Well, you can use all of them.
I could look for the events namespace.
I was going to say, if you find anything that's in the events namespace, and you'll know that.
It might
you can use the container debug pipe grid event, and you will see that that will work. We are working on adding like real filters.
Yeah, so there isn't currently a great go click on this link and you can see all the list of events. But you could write some code that loads up the event dispatcher and says print our list of events, and then you would know. Offhand, the ones that you're going to care about for Drupal 8 are related to entity CRUD operations. So save, update, delete of any entity is going to trigger an event. In Drupal 7 you had hook init and hook boot, so really early runtime operations. Now that Drupal 8 uses Symfony for a lot of that kernel, the Symfony kernel, to kind of handle requests, accepting a request and figuring out how to respond to it. Those really early operations are now events, and they're actually Symfony events, because the Symfony components that Drupal makes use of is dispatching an event that's hey, the system just turned on, do you care? Or hey, the system's about to shut down, do you want to do anything? And then the migrate API in Drupal 8 makes use of events for things I'm about to import this row, do you want to do anything? I just imported this row, do you want to do anything? And that's there's a handful of others, but I would say those are the ones where you're going to encounter it the most. Other questions? Yeah.
Is there a performance hit using events and hooks?
Is there a performance hit, or what are the performance implications of events versus hooks? Yes, there is. The code complexity of calling an event is significant in comparison to the code complexity of calling a function. I would say at some level it's like debating, is echo faster than print? Yeah, one of them's potentially faster. Hooks are certainly faster because they're a much simpler system. It's literally does this function exist? If so, call it. And that's functionality that's built into the PHP language. So that's basically C code that's getting executed within PHP. It's super fast. Events, there's a little bit more abstraction that happens, right? You have to you have to get a copy of the event dispatching service first. So that means you have to invoke the service container, and it needs to return the event dispatcher. And then you need to say dispatch this particular event. And then the event dispatcher needs to go, okay, I'm going to dispatch the node save or the entity save event. I need to go find all of the places, all of the classes that are potentially listening, subscribe to that event, and see if they are, and then load that class and then call its method. So there's quite a bit of overhead there, and so hooks are faster. But again, I think that like my guess is that you're unlikely to run into scenarios where that is the thing that's slowing your application down, is that you're using an event versus a hook. Drupal does a pretty decent job of caching the list of known events and things that are implementing it. So it's actually like, it doesn't in real time, it doesn't say, sweet, somebody just had this event, like I'm gonna go find everyone that's listening. It actually, like, the first time Drupal's bootstrapped, it says, give me a list of everything that listens to any event, and I'll keep that list so that later on when I go to dispatch, I've got a lookup table that I can use to really more quickly dispatch things. That of course gets flushed whenever the cache is flushed, but that's my roundabout answer. Events are slower, but it mostly doesn't matter. Does that answer your question? All right. It's okay. You can say no if it doesn't. Yeah. Well, sure. Yeah. And hooks are. So that's the big argument right now for the hook form alter issue, and why forms haven't been entirely converted to events. In that case, it's significantly slower. And hook form alter on a Drupal page is oftentimes called like 100 times for a single page load, or maybe not 100, but dozens of times. Like a single page could easily contain a dozen different forms, and so that hook is called a bunch of times. In that case, it does start to get slower. And I suppose in aggregate, if you converted every single hook to an event, and now you're talking like there's, let's say, 100 hooks are invoked for every page request. Instead, you're dispatching 100 events. It gets slower. Yeah. But I'm standing by my recommendation that I still would recommend. If you're writing custom code and you're trying to decide, should I invoke a hook or dispatch an event, I would say dispatch an event and leave the performance problem to Drupal core to resolve how to more efficiently dispatch events. Yeah, not my problem. Any other questions? Awesome. That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good one.